As Cindy said, I'm Bob Plott. It's a pleasure being here. Gosh, it's been, I don't know how many programs we've done here, and they're all just great. Cindy and our staff do such a wonderful job. I try to keep all my programs really informal, just like folks talking around a campfire or around the living room fireplace or front porch or whatever. And I'm going to do the same thing today. I was telling some of the folks before we started, 2022, I got COVID and pneumonia, double pneumonia, and was in the hospital for about a month, a little over a month, and intensive care for 2 weeks, and nearly died twice, and lost 71 pounds in 3 weeks. Had to learn how to walk again and take physical therapy to learn how to walk again. And as a result, some of the aftermath of that was some nerve damage in my legs. And oddly enough, there were things that had some memory issues. People, I've always been great with shaking hands with somebody one time and knowing who they were and remembering who they were for a year later. Now, a lot of times I'll see a face and I'll go, I know you, but I can't remember your name, Somebody's probably getting old too, but those of you here for the Plott program last month, I've retained all that. I was able, I guess because it's been in my soul, so to speak, my family, I could stand up right out of the hospital and do that whole program without any notes. But programs like these, I generally have notes with me for two reasons. One, to keep me on track, and to also make sure I get all the dates correct, because there are a ton of dates here and a lot of things happening, and we got a lot of ground to cover in about 45 minutes because I don't want to take up your whole day. So thank you so much for coming. We'll get started. The name of this program is Kings Mountain and the Aftermath. A lot of people, as Cindy was talking about, and we were talking about earlier, a lot of people don't realize the importance the South played in the Revolutionary War. And here at the America's 250th, I think it's important that we talk about that and make people aware of it. I watched Ken Burns' Revolutionary War documentary with great interest and was pleased with some of it and displeased with some of it. I was very pleased with the start of it because I thought he did a really good job talking about the issues with Native Americans, talking about the unrest that was taking place long before 1776. But I really felt like I thought he would devote a whole episode just on the war in the South, and he didn't, because it was really the turning point of the war. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, as Cindy said, and we've talked about this before, and I talked to some folks when we got started, we all know about the American Civil War that took place in the 1860s, North versus South, Lee versus Lincoln, so on and so forth. That truly was, of course, truly an appropriate name, the Civil War. It was a brother versus brother. But so too was the Revolutionary War, particularly in the South. And people either don't know that or have conveniently forgotten it. We'll get into Kings Mountain, for example, shortly, but at the Battle of Kings Mountain, there were only 2 native British officers there. Everybody else was fighting on the British side was American. So this was American loyalists to the crown versus American patriots. And there'd been friction between these groups for a long time leading up to that. So the title of this program could very easily have been 4 Hours That Changed the American Revolution. And why would we call it that? Well, there were 3 major battles. First one was Kings Mountain, second was Cowpens, and the last one was Guilford Courthouse. That all took place either in North or South Carolina, and they're all within about 150 miles from each other or around each other. So you draw a circle around there 150 miles, and those 3 battles are that close to each other. Remarkably, none of these battles lasted more than 2 hours. Kings Mountain and Cowpens barely lasted an hour, and Guilford Courthouse was about 2 hours. But they were all decisive victories for the Patriots, Kings Mountain in particular. And they really kept hope alive for the American cause, because up to that time, things really weren't going that well. We'd won some battles in the North, but not a lot. And King had sent Cornwallis to the south to make sure that they controlled the south, and they pretty much did at that point. So I want to discuss all three battles, and I also want to have an interesting side note, I think, to some tie-ins to Kings Mountain here in Caldwell County. But we'll start with Kings Mountain. As noted, the situation was dire in America in 1780. They had suffered losses at Camden, we had suffered losses at Charleston and Wilmington. All those towns had been lost to the British or under British control. And Colonel Bannister Tarleton, who was just a complete savage, was ravaging the country. He had what he called his dragoons, which was basically cavalrymen, and they were just conducting a reign of terror, killing people right and left, hanging people for no reason, tar and feathering people. His commanding officer was General Cornwallis, but the two guys who did most of the fighting in the South were Colonel Patrick Ferguson and Tarleton. And both of them were interesting guys for two different reasons. Ferguson was nicknamed the Bulldog for his fierce tenacity in battle. The guy was just extremely courageous. He had invented a rifle. Back in those days, you had flintlock rifles that required you to pour a powder charge down the barrel, put a patch and ball, ram it down, put some powder in the pan, and fire. A really good rifleman, an expert rifleman, could probably shoot maybe twice in a minute, minute and a half if they were really good. But with this, Ferguson invented this breech loading rifle where he loaded from the breech. You didn't have to put it down the barrel. And it resulted in 3 or 4 times quicker. Why the British didn't mass manufacture this weapon, I don't know. I'm glad they didn't, but it could have been a turning point for the war. Ferguson also built pistols that had the same feature. Now, Ferguson was a very handsome man. He was very courageous. He was fair-minded. He didn't, unlike Tarleton, he didn't try to terrorize people. He tried to treat people fairly. He was brave in combat, but he was fair. And he was a ladies' man. He kept 2 women in camp with him at all times, calling them his assistants, but really they were a little bit more than that. He led from the front. He was beloved by his men. He wore a distinct plaid shirt so they could identify him. And he rode a big white horse into combat and blew a signal whistle that ordered, and the different blows from the whistle indicated what direction the troops were supposed to go in. Now, Tarleton, on the other hand, as I said, was just evil. He would kill anybody, women, children, didn't matter. He was despised, feared, and had terrorized the South. But he was, he wasn't a coward, I'll give him that. He had been wounded in battle several times, and we'll talk more about that. But as I said, Ferguson and Tarleton had been commanded by Cornwallis to eradicate the rebel cause in the South. They were really concerned about the over mountain men, or the backcountry frontiersmen who lived around here in Wilkes County, down around Rutherford, over in Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, upstate South Carolina. But his first big mistake was he sent a message to these mountain villages telling them that he didn't want to hurt them, he didn't want to fight them, but they needed to submit to the crown or face the consequences. Well, this was probably the worst thing he could have done, because these guys had their hands full, a lot of them on the far western frontier, fighting Indians at that time and defending their forts and households. And so they probably would have just as well spent their time at home. But when they were threatened that way, they felt like they had to react, and they did. Meanwhile, Tarleton was roaming the Piedmont, completely terrorizing the region, and so the Patriots had to do something. So the Patriot leaders made plans to address this issue. Let's talk about who they were. And I'll tell you a little bit about each one of them and give you an important point. We hear a lot about John Sevier, and rightfully so, in Tennessee, Isaac Shelby from Virginia, and later governor of Kentucky, and rightfully so. But what people don't tell you, and what you don't realize, is of the 11 Patriot commanders at Kings Mountain, 8 of them were from North Carolina. And we'll talk about that too. So the leaders were Colonel William Campbell of Virginia, Colonel James Johnson of nearby Lincoln County, Colonel John Sevier of Tennessee. Now, Sevier was probably about the American equivalent of Tarleton in that he was a fierce, fierce fighter. He hated Indians. He would kill Indian babies and said that nits made lice. He made no apologies for it. He was a tough guy. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Hamright, also of Lincoln County, was known as the Terror of the Tories. He was a fierce fighter, and he had a group of militia guys called the South Fork Boys. Colonel Joseph McDowell, who lived at Quaker Meadows in nearby Burke County, he fought in the Rutherford campaign, who we'll talk about in our next program, Ramseur's Mill and Cowpens, and led numerous campaigns against the Cherokee, the biggest campaign in 1782. Now, one of my favorite commanders and characters is Colonel Benjamin Cleveland. Cleveland was from Wilkes County. He lived in the Roaring Creek community, and if there ever was a colorful character, it was Ben Cleveland. He was a big man. He was a little over 6 feet tall, which for that time was big, but he was about as wide as he was tall. He weighed well over 300 pounds. He loved to fight. They would have boxing matches or wrestling matches at his house. He loved to race horses. He would gamble on anything. It didn't matter what it was. He loved to gamble. And he was a fierce Indian fighter and a fierce patriot. There was a lot of, before the Battle of Kings Mountain, there were continual skirmishes between the Loyalists and the Patriots in the mountains of western North Carolina, up around Boone and Avery County, Ashe County, and down into Wilkes County. Cleveland had a brother who had been captured by the British, and he rescued him and got him away. A little bit later, he then found and captured 3 Loyalists or British leaders and hung 2 of them. The third one, he gave him the option of cutting his own ears off or hanging. The guy cut his own ears off. So these guys didn't play. They were hard men. Colonel James Williams was from 96, South Carolina. He was the leader of the South Carolina militia, and he was one of the commanders killed in action at Kings Mountain. Colonel Isaac Shelby was another interesting guy. He lived near Bristol, Tennessee, a renowned Indian fighter, and he later, after the war, became the governor of Kentucky. This guy's not many people know about, but Colonel James Winston was for the Van River region of Stokes County, North Carolina, and he was on the Rutherford campaign, later fought at Guilford Courthouse, and actually he was at all 3 battles. He was at Kings Mountain, Guilford Courthouse, and Cowpens. One of the few people that did that. Major William Chronicle, also from Lincoln County, was another commander who was killed at Kings Mountain. Now, all these men were considered equals, but they realized that they would probably run into trouble if they just all, this group listened to this guy, this group listened to that guy. It could turn into chaos. So they agreed that they had to have one commanding officer, and that guy was Colonel Campbell. Now, a lot's been written about these Over Mountain men, and rightfully so. As I said earlier, much of the credit and leadership has been given to Tennesseans, and that's just not true. It's unfair. As you can see, I said 11, it was actually 10 Patriot commanders at Kings Mountain. 7 of the 10 were from either North Carolina, 6, or South Carolina, 1. And almost all of them lived within 50 miles of where we sit right now. So, the British, on the other hand, were led by Colonel Ferguson, whom we already discussed, and Colonel Abraham de Peyster. Ferguson and de Peyster were the only 2 British natives, or natives of England, on that mountain. Elias Powell, who was buried here in Caldwell County, was an adjutant officer to Ferguson. And remember that name because we're going to talk more about him shortly. So that leads us to our early point about this truly being a civil war. This was one of the few major battles fought entirely between Americans. As I said, there were only 2 British officers on the field. And there's debate. It may have just been one because some people say the Peyster may not have been from Britain, but I've never been able to prove that one way or the other. But the days leading up to the battle have been chaotic. They were filled with raids, guys raiding, patriots raiding loyalist farms and vice versa. There were patriots from 4 different states. They had agreed they were going to rally near what they called Gilberttown, which is now Rutherfordton, North Carolina. And you hear a lot about the Over Mountain Victory Trail as if it was only really one major trail. The truth is that there were several. There was the one coming from Tennessee that's credited as being the Over Mountain Trail, but there were also several coming down from Stokes County, Wilkes County, from upstate South Carolina, and other locations where they would rally. But by early October, as these guys were coming towards Gilberttown, they were rallying at different locations. The group was getting bigger and bigger. By early October, the Patriot Army now had about 1,800 men. And they had moved toward Kings Mountain, where Ferguson was camped on top of the mountain. Now, if you've ever been to Kings Mountain, it's not a really big mountain, but I was telling a lady earlier, she hadn't been there before, but she's going down later. It's really a special place. I mean, if you study the battle and know anything about it, you really get the feel for what happened there. It's one of those places where you kind of get cold chills, like there's spirits or something there, or I do anyway. But Ferguson was confident that he had good troops, and he was confident that he had the higher ground, which of course is always an advantage. And he made the statement that not even God Almighty himself could take him off that mountain. Well, that was kind of the truth, because he died there, which we'll talk about in a minute. He was wrong about that, though, as far as losing the battle. But the Americans arrived in cold camp at the base of the mountain on October 6th. Now, even though this was early October, the weather was cold. The troops had come through snow when they crossed Yellow Mountain Gap. Some of them were barefoot. They weren't well stocked in terms of food and clothing. Several later wrote that they had not eaten in several days, and several had worn their moccasins out completely on the trip and were barefooted. But they all had one thing in common: they had those deadly flintlock rifles, and they knew how to use them. Now, going back to the rifles a second, most of your troops, your army, regular commissioned army, carried smoothbore rifles, which are kind of like the equivalent of shotguns today. And they were really good for close range fighting. You couldn't, from here to the case there, okay, but much further than that, they weren't effective. And their idea was they would line up a line of men and just shoot a barrage, and another line behind them and shoot another barrage, with just like a whole wall of shrapnel and bullets coming to you. The Americans, on the other hand, used flintlock rifles, a barrel rifle, which meant they had twist in it. Those rifles were much more accurate. They could shoot up to maybe 150, 200 yards if you knew how to do it, and they did. So they fought Indian style. They would go fight tree to tree, jump out, shoot somebody, reload, shoot somebody else at great distance. And the British, even the British loyalists, other than Tarleton, kind of had a code. Even George Washington had this code that you didn't kill officers. There was a kind of a code of conduct. The American patriots didn't fall for that. They're like, kill the officers first, take them down first, and they did. So right before sunup on October 7th, Colonel Campbell gathered his men and he gave them a very short, simple speech. He said, "Each of you are your own officers. Shout like hell, fight like devils, do the best you can, and fight them tree to tree, Indian style. Shoot their officers first. Look for Ferguson's plaid shirt." Now, there's been descriptions about these guys. British survivors later said these guys fought like devils from infernal regions. They were tall, they were sinewy, raw-boned men with long matted hair. They were savages. And they liked to be like Indians. They would scream and yell when they fought, and the British called them the Yelling Boys. At 7 a.m., right about daybreak on October 7th, 1780, it was a cool, rainy morning. The Yelling Boys moved towards the mountain, the base of the mountain, and started climbing up it. And shortly before 3 p.m. that day, they were all in position and they assaulted the hill from all sides. Ferguson was completely surrounded. The battle was over in less than an hour. By 4 p.m., there were 250 dead Loyalist bodies littering the ground, including Ferguson, whose bullet-riddled body was found with a signal whistle still in his hand and a smaller whistle in his pocket. There's debates as far as how many bullet holes were in him. Some people say 8, some people say 10 to 20. 2 or 3 men have taken specific claim for killing him. I don't think they can, but that's just part of the legend. 163 more men were wounded, and 668 captured. Now, the interesting thing about the captured POWs were that almost all of them were hung, and we'll talk about that too. The Patriots, on the other hand, had 58 men wounded, most of them not badly, a few of them badly. The Patriots, they only had 29 men killed, so certainly that's a terrible loss, but compared to what the British lost, it was an overwhelming victory for the Patriots. Now, here's an interesting side story. Shelby and Campbell went through Ferguson's belongings, and Shelby kept the large whistle that was in Ferguson's hand and his sword. McDowell kept the china, some of which is on display in Marion today at the Carson House Museum. Cleveland's horse had been shot out from under him, and he was such a big guy that he needed a big horse, and Ferguson had one. So Cleveland got that horse. Now, an interesting side note to the horse was that there were 2 holsters on the horse that had 2 of the Ferguson's pistols that he had built himself, or had built, the breech-loading pistols. A friend of mine bought those 2 pistols about a month ago and paid $250,000 for them. He can get twice that if he can prove that they came from Cleveland, and he can. I can help him do that. So I hope I get a commission. He probably won't do that today. But anyway, Isaac Shelby saw Captain Elias Powell. Elias Powell was a Loyalist who was now a POW nearby, and he also was an adjutant officer for Ferguson. Powell was highly respected by both sides. They knew him, they knew he was a good man, they knew he was fighting for the wrong side, but out of respect for him, Shelby gave Powell the smaller signal whistle, and he took it back home with him. And instead of being hung, Shelby made sure that Powell was sent to Hillsborough, North Carolina, to the POW camp there, instead of being hung as almost all of his associates were. Now, Powell didn't stay in the prison camp long. He swore allegiance to America and was later released and returned home to here in Caldwell County. He became a respected citizen, he became a preacher, and he became fiercely loyal to America. He lived in a community called Powelltown or Powelton. He died at the age of 77 in 1832 and is buried in the Lower Creek Baptist Church Cemetery here in Lenore. Now, the whistle stayed in the family for generations and supposedly was later lost by a relative who took it out west, supposedly to Texas. But there are rumors, some pretty good rumors, I think, that it may still be here in Caldwell County. You see, this was kind of an embarrassing situation for a lot of people. After the war, a lot of people who had served for the Loyalist side didn't want anybody to know about it. There was a guy, again, here in Caldwell County whose father was a fierce Loyalist. His son fought for the Americans, and they never, they hated each other the rest of their lives. But, so the point being here is a lot of people wanted to keep it secret. And I've been told there's a theory that that whistle still may be here in Caldwell County today, that some of the family just doesn't really want people to know about it. I don't know if that's true or not, may or may not be, but the Powell family still lives here. In fact, one of their multiple great-grandsons was a preacher who I think just passed away not too long ago. So there's a real connection there. And the same guy who bought the pistols has indicated that he would pay $15,000 for the whistle if anybody could ever find the whistle. So keep that in mind if you ever know about it. So after the battle, they kind of, again, because they were all volunteers, they weren't part of a commissioned army, some of them went to join Daniel Morgan at Cowpens to fight there, while others just went home. They felt like, hey, we've done our job, we're going back home, we got to take care of the frontier, our frontier families. But the entire time, one thing that not many people talk about is they plundered all the bodies, they plundered everything they could find. Ferguson had evidently quite a bit of money, and they hoarded it all, put it in wagons. They hung a lot of guys there at Kings Mountain. They marched some with them back towards Gilberttown and back towards Cowpens, and every day and every night when they camped, they hung more. One of the patriots who was there was later quoted with Lyman Draper as saying that he had never seen more beautiful fruit hanging from a tree than a British Tory, and he wished God had made more fruit that way. So General Washington, George Washington, everybody knows who he is, he had wisely named Nathaniel Greene the commander of the Southern Theater. Now keep in mind that the Patriots who were Kings Mountain were not under any Patriot Army command. They were their own militia army. But when they went to Cowpens to fight there, they were joining commissioned troops commanded by Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan considered Greene considered Daniel Morgan to be his right-hand man, and for good reason. And this is two other really interesting characters. Morgan, especially Morgan. Greene was a lifelong Quaker. He had really struggled with going against his pacifist beliefs to fight in the army, but he knew that he needed to. And he had done well in the North, and Washington knew they had trouble in the South and sent him south. So Kings Mountain had been a big boost for morale, and so then Greene sent Daniel Morgan south to intercept Tarleton and Cornwallis. Now Morgan isn't like Benjamin Cleveland. He's one of these guys you could do an entire movie or book about, and people have written books about him, and rightfully so. He was a big man for his time, very muscular. He had grown up on the western Pennsylvania frontier, a fierce Indian fighter, expert woodsman, really good friend with Daniel Boone. In fact, he and Boone had been teamsters together for General Braddock during the French and Indian War. And he was a big, strong man, great fist fighter. And after the French and Indian War, he started a freight business near Stanton, Virginia, and ran a very lucrative business there. But it was during the French and Indian War when he really began to hate the British. He saw how they treated Americans. He didn't like how they fought. And he had gotten in a fight and had shown some disrespect to an officer, and the officer ordered him punished and tied up and given 500 lashes with a bullwhip. Now, 100 lashes to 200 lashes generally killed a man. 500 was a sure death wish. Not a wish for him, but for the commander. But the officer was frustrated because he had Morgan tied up and he was giving him had a guy beating him, and Morgan would not scream, he would not holler, he showed no emotion at all other than just gritting his teeth. And the commander told him, said, if you'll just say you're sorry, if you'll just show some emotion, I'll make him stop. And he wouldn't. And so they got to what they thought was 500 lashes, and the commander told him to stop, and Morgan said, no, you're one short, you owe King George one more. And because he'd been counting. So he got one more lash. And then he spit on him, and his back was scarred for life. After the war, he fought in several big battles against the Shawnee and led several expeditions in Kentucky. He moved to the Shenandoah Valley, later near Winchester, Virginia. And again, he joined the army and fought in the north at Saratoga, at Bemis Heights. And at Bemis Heights, he commanded a group of sharpshooters, snipers, if you will, riflemen who, including Tim Murphy, who made a legendary shot when he killed a British officer. He climbed up in a tree and killed a British officer from about 200 yards. Morgan had always instructed his men to do this, and George Washington was outraged by it. This was just not how, this wasn't proper war etiquette. You couldn't do that. Morgan didn't believe, he felt you were in a war, you need to fight a war, so he resigned. He was frustrated. And so he resigned as an officer, and he returned home to Virginia until 1779, when Greene contacted him and ordered him, begged him to come back and promote him to general. So Morgan arrives in the South in 1780, early 1780, around January, February, and he's fighting in skirmishes all over the South with some commissioned troops, as well as getting an additional militia to join his provincials. Shortly after the Battle of Kings Mountain, he was encamped in South Carolina with his sights set on Tarleton and Cornwallis. Now, after Kings Mountain, as I said, many of these guys went home, but others, like Joseph McDowell, had joined Morgan. Now, in the meantime, as the men were returning home, again, they were stopping and pillaging homes and getting more loot and hanging more people. So, and again, as bad as this sounds, this was nothing different than what the Loyalists had already done to the Americans on a repeated basis as well, and far less than what Tarleton had done. And again, this is another reminder of what this was truly a civil war. So the war was still anyone's to win. Kings Mountain had been a big plus, of course, but Morgan had to look for the right place to win another significant victory with his own troops. And so he kind of feigned retreat, and Tarleton was kind of chasing him for several days, and finally Morgan found what he felt like was the best place in the world to fight, which was a big place called Cowpens, which, as the name implies, was just a big pasture where cows had been kept. The Patriot leaders were primarily Morgan at Cowpens, as Greene remained in North Carolina, and he had some militia guys there too. Now, the battle began at sunrise on January 17, 1781 at about 7 a.m. Morgan had command of 800 troops. These was a combination of regular army and provincials. Cornwallis had almost 1,200 men, and these were crack troops. They were British regulars along with Scottish Highlanders. All these guys had seen a lot of combat in America and in Europe, so they were used to fighting. But they marched into the field in classic fashion, military fashion, columns straight across, blowing their flutes, beating their drums, walking straight into fire. Now, Morgan had a new strategy that nobody had ever seen before. It proved to be brilliant. He set his men up in 3 lines. The first line was kind of the least experienced men, and he ordered them to fire two shots and fall back. Standing behind those men was a little group of more experienced guys. They fired 2 shots and fell back. The third group was the most experienced troops. They were the most seasoned guys, the guys who had fought many times, and they then opened their own salvo. Now, this was 3 lines face to face. On the flanks, he had cavalry. The cavalry consisted of Colonel William Washington, who was a relative of George Washington, and Robert E. Lee's grandfather, a guy called Light Horse Harry Lee, who was a renowned cavalry guy. So Washington and Lee attacked from the left and right flanks. The British were walking into an ambush box. This is a classic ambush box, a U-shaped. You had your riflemen here, cavalrymen on each side, a U-shaped thing. So it was just a death box, so to speak. The results were devastating to the British. Their ranks were decimated. Morgan had ordered a separate set of snipers to target the officers, contrary to what Washington told him. And more than 50% of the British officers were killed. Cornwallis lost a total of 110 troops, 200 wounded, and 712 taken prisoner. Now, this statistic I'm going to tell you, let me explain it. I say this sometimes and people get confused by it. The British have lost 75% of their army at Cowpens. Now, that does not mean they lost 75% of their entire army in the United States. That meant they lost 75% of their southern troops, okay? Tarleton was there too, and he was one of the British officers that had been injured, but he managed to escape. The Patriots lost 68 men and 68 regular troops and 80 militiamen. The battle was over by 8 o'clock, a little bit before 8. It just barely lasted an hour. So again, this was another one of those battles that was over in less than an hour. Kings Mountain had turned the tide and given the South, given America hope. But Cowpens, and soon, a little bit later, Guilford Courthouse really won the war, in my opinion, because Cornwallis had now lost most of his entire army in the South. Now, there were still campaigns and battles going on up north, and so there was a northern army there too. The British retreated back to North Carolina, although Tarleton was ordered to stay behind and harass the Americans as much as he could. After Cowpens, just as Kings Mountain, the militia guys, because they weren't regular army, had the freedom to go home or stay. Some of them stayed, some of them went home. Joseph Winston, as I mentioned before, stayed with Morgan, and he fought in all three major battles. But Morgan's men needed to rest, they needed to take care of their wounded, and so they decided to head back to North Carolina as well, with the idea they were going to head toward. At that time, they weren't really sure it was going to be Guilford Courthouse, but that's what it ended up being. But to move faster, he separated his command into two groups, and they were both heading back this way where we are today. And they came to, if you know where the Catawba County, Iredell County line is, the Catawba River runs right through it. There's a bridge runs over it, separates the two counties. Lookout Dam is right there, and Lookout Lake is behind it. That was Island Ford at that time, so there was no dam there, no lake there. And they crossed that ford going back toward Greensboro or Guilford Courthouse, and they decided that their loot was holding them back, so they didn't want to just throw it away or give it up, so they buried it there in one of the cliffs. That loot that we don't believe it's ever been found. If it does exist, this kind of legend, it may be true, may not be true, but if it is, it's underwater now, so it probably never will be found, but it's kind of an interesting side story, I think. By early March, both of these groups had joined together, Morgan's men, and they had ended up in an area called Guilford Courthouse, which is right almost in the middle of downtown Greensboro today. It's hard to imagine with all that metropolitan area beside it. You got that little park in the middle of it, but at that time, there was nothing at Guilford Courthouse but Guilford Courthouse. There was a courthouse there and maybe a little store or something, but it was just a little crossroads town. Or no, town would be kind, just a place. But Morgan had picked that out. He commanded, and Greene commanded about 800 troops. And again, this was a mix of regular army and militia. And Cornwallis had over 1,200 men with him, most all of them, again, regular seasoned veterans. Now, other Patriot officers that were here included Colonel Washington, who was at Cowpens, Colonel Charles Lynch, Light Horse Harry Lee, who we've already talked about, Robert Kirkland, and Edward Stevens, most of whom were from Virginia. But there was a Patriot newcomer to the battle that is another really fascinating character to me, a guy by the name of Peter Francisco. And some of you may be familiar with him. Anybody ever heard of Peter Francisco? So I know Cindy has. You have, okay. Peter Francisco. He was despite the fact he's on a postage stamp, there's multiple towns named after him in North Carolina and Virginia. Not many people know about him, but he was a hulk of a man. He was supposedly the biggest man in the Revolution. He was called the Hercules of the Revolution. He was about 6'8" and weighed 300 pounds, and it was just solid muscle. He'd been a blacksmith his whole life, He just had tremendous strength. He was orphaned. They really don't know. They think he may have been Portuguese. They don't know. But he was found on a dock in Virginia at the age of 5. Somebody had abandoned him. And he was adopted by a cousin of Patrick Henry, of all people. And he became a blacksmith, as I mentioned, and he joined the American Army. By that time, he'd grown into manhood and he'd been blacksmithing since he was a boy. He'd been known for being a great fist fighter and having just incredible physical strength and extremely muscular. But he joined the American Army in 1776. He fought bravely at Brandywine, at Monmouth, Germantown, and was badly wounded at Monmouth. And this was witnessed and has been documented. It sounds like a folktale, but it's not. He was once in a battle where a cannon was about to be captured and they couldn't get it off the field. So he took the cannon off to prevent the British from capturing. He carried a cannon. It had to weigh 1,100 pounds. After the Battle of Germantown, he was returning home to recuperate from his wounds when he was attacked by Tarleton and his men. There's our man Tarleton again. He's in Virginia now. And Tarleton had killed, Francisco killed 3 of Tarleton's men and escaped on a stolen horse despite the fact he was wounded. But Francisco was serving under Greene here at Guilford Courthouse. So with Morgan and Greene back together, Morgan convinced Greene to employ basically the same successful field strategy that he'd employed at Cowpens, the ambush box. So the battle began at 1:30 p.m. on March 15th, 1781 at Guilford Courthouse. And again, same thing, British advance, same way they did before, column after column. They go right into this ambush box, and again, they're just decimated. Now this battle lasted almost 2 hours, with terrible losses to the British. At the height of the battle, Cornwallis was so frustrated that there was a big melee of Americans and British fighting. You couldn't really tell who was who, and he commanded his British troops to fire into that group, killing some of his own men. I mean, he didn't care. He just wanted to end this thing. And he killed some Americans too. But by about 3 p.m., the battle had ended with the Patriot officers kind of, Greene and Morgan had surveyed the field and thought, well, you know, we're not gaining too much here. We've killed a lot more of them than they have of us, but we're still kind of outnumbered, so we're going to pull back. Well, the British foolishly considered this a victory, but it wasn't. They had been, again, soundly beaten. Now, to give you an idea, they had lost over 100 men. They had 400 wounded and had 100 captured. So Tarleton was there too, again, and he again was among the wounded. So this guy, say what you want about him, he was a tough guy. And again, more than a quarter of the 100 being killed, 25 were British officers. So again, they're knocking off those officers as quick as they can. And again, this was Morgan's sharpshooters doing the job. The Americans, on the other hand, had lost only 80 men and had about 200 wounded. So between Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, the Cornwallis had literally lost pretty much the rest of his Southern army. 25% of his army was lost at Guilford Courthouse. He had already lost about 75% at Cowpens. So he was retreating back to Virginia with just a small group of men, and he was joined there by the northern British troops. Right after that, Greene and Morgan moved deep into North Carolina backcountry, and then moved back into South Carolina, where they recaptured Camden, South Carolina, Charleston, and soon Wilmington. So now the South was total control by Americans again. So the war was won in the South. Random skirmishes continued through the summer, but the Patriots had clearly won the war. They were further strengthened that later when France became an ally and sent Lafayette to Virginia. Meanwhile, Cornwallis had retreated to Yorktown, Virginia, where Washington and his troops surrounded him and laid siege to the town on September 28, 1781. Peter Francisco was there too. This went on for about 3 weeks, and the British were running out of food. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew they were beaten. So finally, on October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis formally surrendered and the war was over. It had been a decisive Patriot victory. The Northern troops surrendered. During that siege, there were over 300 men killed, 301 wounded, and then about close to 6,000, maybe 7,000 Northern troops, with what was left of the Southern troops, surrendered. So these 3 battles, Kings Mountain, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, truly, and all of them in North and South Carolina, all of them led by men from the South, except for Greene, and all within 150 miles of each other, really truly turned the tide of the war. And as I said before, none of these battles lasted more than 2 hours. Kings Mountain and Cowpens, barely an hour. And again, these were mostly Southern troops, and in some cases, Southern Americans fighting Southern Americans. So it really was a civil war. But the tide of the war had been won. It turned. And it was won in the South. Now that's something that you don't hear much. As I said, when I saw Ken Burns' documentary, I really admired his work, but I was really disappointed that I think it was in the 3rd or 4th episode, he just kind of gives passing mention to these battles, which were the turning point of the war, really. And it's a shame, because this is something you don't read much about in history books. As Cindy noted earlier, you ask a kid, about what's the significance of Kings Mountain, they look at you like you're crazy. They don't know. So that's one thing we try to do, and what we do in our programs is talk about this, make people aware of it, and talk about the importance of it. It's something we should be proud of, because most of us probably had ancestors there fighting in some form or fashion. So I think it's something that we all should take pride in, something that we should all tell other people about. As we're here at this 250th year of anniversary, culminating in July 4th, 2027, we'll be doing more programs. We'll be doing a program next month about the Regulator Rebellion and about some of the things that led up to the war, which, people think the war started in 1776 at Bunker Hill. It didn't. It did, technically, but it started a long time before that. So we'll talk about that too. But again, these are things we can all take pride in. Appreciate you folks coming this morning, listening to me. Be back in March. Please come back then again as well. We've got Plott Fest coming up May 16th in Maggie Valley, North Carolina. That'll be an all-day festival celebrating the Plott Hound, the official state dog of North Carolina, that my family originated in 1750, or brought to America in 1750. And it'll be an all-day festival with music and crafts and 250 Plott Hounds doing competition events and food and all kinds of fun. So come on up for us and join us for that. Got books here for sale, and I'll open the floor up for any questions if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
After the Battle of Kings Mountain, I know all over Central Plott, it was one because all these mountain people came across from Tennessee and down there fight because these British were coming up there to mess with them.
Sure.
Otherwise they don't. Where did those folks go after the Battle of Kings Mountain? Did they continue on in the fight, or did they go back home?
Most of them went back home. Now, and you mentioned Tennessee. Tennessee was important, but as I said, don't lose sight of the fact that these mountain men were North Carolina mountain men, and really Piedmont mountain men. That's a misnomer, but Benjamin Cleveland was from Wilkes County. You got guys here like William Lenore was here in Caldwell County. You got guys that fought on the British sides like Powell, who was here in Caldwell County. So there's a lot of these folks, McDowell over in Burke County. You got a lot of these folks, Shelby from Virginia, Sevier from Tennessee, and they had their own militia group. Sevier's brother was severely wounded and I think died later from wounds at Kings Mountain. But don't not taking anything away from the Tennesseans, but I think that they've been given way too much credit when the fact, as I said, 7 of the 10 commanders were from North Carolina or South Carolina. But your point is very, very true. These guys were just, they came to America because they didn't want anybody to mess with them. They wanted to have their own religious freedom. They wanted to be able to make whatever living they wanted to make, however they wanted to make it. And you don't bother me, I don't bother you. We're friends. You bother me, we're going to have trouble. And so when the British made the mistake of threatening them and saying, you're going to submit to us or else, they're like, we left England for that. We ain't going to put up with it here, So, and they didn't. But to your point, most of those guys went home because, as I said, there was a lot of Cherokee battles going on then. I mean, I say battles, they're things that you don't even know about. Margaret Swan wrote a great book called Across the River, which is about the forts just in Burke County on this side of the Catawba River. There were like 30, 40 forts that were just a complete, constant, fighting with the Cherokee during this time. So these guys had left their homes, their wives, their children, with just a small group of men guarding them or helping them. They were in precarious positions, so they needed to get back home as soon. Most of them did. Now, some of them didn't. Some of them went to Cowpens, as I mentioned. Several of them fought at all 3 battles, but the bulk of them went back home.
Is it fair to say a lot of these men that came out of the mountains were Scotch Irish, Ulster Irish, who didn't have any particular reason to feel loyalty to the British? They just wanted to be up in the mountains, be left alone.
Totally.
And so they came down because the British were coming to mess with them.
Yeah.
Then went back home.
That's absolutely true. And the truth of the matter is, if, I want to be careful how I say this, they really didn't care to have fought the British if the British had left them alone. I mean, if they were in their own world. They were in an area that they weren't getting any support from anybody. They were living off their own hook. I mean, they were growing their own food, hunting their own game, making their own liquor, doing whatever they wanted to do. And that's what they wanted to do. And if the British left them alone, then okay, They lived in America. They left Britain and Scotland and for the very same reasons that we all know about. So they didn't have any love for Britain. But, Britain, to them, Britain was another world. It was all the way across the ocean, and the towns like Wilmington, Savannah, they were just places you sent your hides to ship off to, and you sent somebody else to do that. So they didn't really have much, till they were pushed, which was a fatal mistake for the British. And we talked about this a lot in the next program I'm going to do. One of the biggest concerns the British had prior to the war was that the black freedmen and the slaves and the Cherokee would band together and fight the British because, white population in South Carolina was minimal. They had sent men like Pickens and Sumter, this gentleman here is related to Sumter, kind of be as buffers on the frontier. We want you out there where the Indians attack you first. So that was another reason they didn't like them. And the British had fought, the Americans had fought with the British in the French and Indian War, which we'll talk about next week or next month, and been mistreated and disrespected. So they hated them. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about a town called 96.
Yes.
Some research that I did, that there were some British, loyalists,
Mm-hmm.
living in Avery County, and they're the ones that captured the brother of Cleveland.
Right.
Harrison. And their goal was to go to 96 because they felt like 96 was a haven for loyalists.
It was.
Okay, so.
Reason was now, again, kind of misleading. and we'll talk about this next month, there were after the French and Indian War, there was an agreement that white people would not go past this boundary, 96 being one of the boundaries. There was a fort in Withful called Fort Chiswell. There was Fort Loudon in Tennessee, and there was another fort closer to North Carolina. Those were 3 British outposts. And basically, they supposedly regulated all travel into that area. And they were there to basically enforce the law that you could not go into Cherokee country. Well, these guys said, they're all standing at the fort. I can go 5 miles from the fort and go on in there. They ain't gonna stop me. And they didn't. And of course, that caused friction and problems too. So yeah, 96 was an official British outpost. So too was Chiswell, so too was Loudon. Loudon fell, and we'll talk about that next month as well. It was actually destroyed by the Cherokee Oconostota and in Chiswell. But during the Revolutionary War, those forts eventually became American controlled.
So what area was the 96? Because I know one of my ancestors fought in.
It's upstate South Carolina, kind of near Seneca, that area, or actually there's a town called 96, so it was right about there. It was so named, even though it's not accurate. It was supposed to be 96 miles from Charleston, but it wasn't. But that was supposed to be the name of it. And like I said, there were several treaty meetings held there during the French and Indian War. In fact, one of the final treaties held there when they decided that, okay, this would be, because up until then, there were Cherokee towns all the way down into the upstate, or almost the lowlands of South Carolina. But they were run off or by the British or by Catawba Indians. Catawba Indians hated the Cherokee, and they had a chief named King Hagler, who was a fierce fighter. We'll talk about him next month too. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned Elias Powell and that he was buried here. I think you said that he did the pledge for allegiance for the Patriots, or?
Yeah, you had, if you were in a prisoner of war camp, before they would release you, you had to pledge an allegiance to the country, to swear your allegiance to the country and deny your allegiance to the crown to be released.
So did he ever fight on our side?
No.
He's not a patriot.
Yeah, no. There was, like I said, this was really a touchy situation. People came back home, they didn't forget what happened. Some of these people were like, you killed my wife, or you killed my kids, or you burned my house down, or you tarred and feathered my brother. I'm not going to forgive you. And you're on the losing side. I'm on the winning side. And it was, I can't remember, I have to check the guy's name, look it up, but there was a young man who fought for the Patriots whose father was a staunch loyalist. So there's all kinds of stories. If you go into Boone, Howard's Knob, I'm familiar with Howard's Knob in downtown Boone, big mountain there. It's named because a loyalist named, I think Benjamin Howard, hid out there during the war because he didn't want to fight. And so there's all kinds of stories like that. So there was a lot of animosity, and I mentioned that whistle. That was one reason when the Powells really wanted to prove that they were Americans. He didn't fight, but after that, I think his sons, grandsons, and so on and so forth fought for America in different wars, maybe 1812 and stuff like that.
Powell Road in War Creek that's that name.
Yeah.
And then on down toward the Aquatic Center, where Ocean Light is, on that way toward Williams Energy, they own a lot of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's called like Powelton or something like that?
It's Powell Road, but it was Powelltown.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's real interesting, and I really find it, to me, fascinating to think that you had those type of relationships, and like I said, it was really truly brother against brother, family against family, and You know, it's hard when you go through loss like that and experience loss like that. And, you know, and to be fair, I mean, you know, the Patriots did their share of the mistreatment too, so. Any other questions? All right, well, thank y'all so much.